It is said that in the days when the mountains of Alborz held their silence like a secret between earth and sky, there traveled a dervish named Yunis, whose footsteps never belonged to one road for long, and whose shadow was often seen at the edges of forgotten caravan paths, where the wind carried the memory of distant prayers, and the scent of dust warmed by centuries of sun. The old men of the northern villages still speak of him in low voices, as if naming him too loudly might disturb the fragile peace of memory. They say he came not as a conqueror of ideas, nor as a seeker of wealth, but as one who listened more than he spoke and carried within him a quiet sadness that never fully left his eyes. It was during a season when autumn had begun to press its golden hands upon the valleys that Yunis made his way toward the fortress of Alamut, rising like a patient thought carved into stone above the mist and ravines where eagles circled in slow reflection, and the world below seemed already half forgotten. In those days the name of Hasan-i Sabbah was spoken with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and reluctant respect depending on who uttered it. Merchants and caravanserais spoke of him as a man who turned solitude into authority, while wandering scholars whispered that he had built not only a fortress but an idea that refused to decay like ordinary stone. Yet Dervish Yunis did not come to judge, nor to seek audience in the manner of courtiers, for he carried no petition in his sleeve, and no desire to be seen as important. Rather he came as travelers often come to such places, drawn by something they cannot fully name, as if the mountain itself had called him in a language older than speech. The path upward was narrow and winding, and at times Yunis walked in silence so deep that even his breathing seemed part of the wind. It is said that shepherds who once glimpsed him from afar thought he was speaking to himself, though in truth he was only listening to the weight of his own thoughts as they softened under the vastness of stone and sky. When he reached the outer gates of Alamut, he was not stopped immediately, for those who guard such places learn to recognize not only danger, but also the absence of it in a man's presence. Yunis was neither threatening nor submissive, but something more difficult to define, like water that remembers every shape it passes through. Inside the fortress, the air was cooler and carried the scent of wet stone and ink and quiet discipline. Men moved with measured purpose, and their eyes held the stillness of those who have long trained their desires into obedience. Yet beneath this order there was also fatigue, not of the body but of the spirit, as if even certainty had grown heavy with time. It was here that Yunis was allowed to wait in a small chamber where a single oil lamp burned steadily, and the walls bore no decoration except the marks of age and contemplation. While he sat, he did not pray in visible gestures, nor did he speak aloud. Instead he closed his eyes and let the silence unfold around him, like an old manuscript being read without words. Later it was told among the servants of the fortress that Hasan-i Sabbah had noticed the dervish not because he demanded attention, but because he did not. This absence of need was rarer than gold in a place built upon intention and discipline, and so a message was sent that the wanderer might be brought into the inner hall, not as a guest of ceremony but as one might invite a rain cloud that has paused above a garden, uncertain whether to pass or remain. When Yunis entered the hall there were no grand greetings, only a measured gaze from those who had long learned to read the weight of silence as carefully as others read speech. At the far end of the chamber sat Hasan-i Sabbah, whose presence did not fill the room with noise, but rather with an unusual clarity, as if every unnecessary thought had been gently removed from the air. The narrator of this tale does not claim to know what words were exchanged first, for those who preserve such memories often remember the pauses more than the sentences. But it is said that Hasan-i Sabbah studied the dervish for a long moment, and then asked not about his journey nor his origin, but about silence itself. Yunis answered not with doctrine, but with the story of a man who once listened so deeply to the desert that he began to forget the difference between emptiness and presence. In that forgetting he found neither enlightenment nor despair, but something simpler and more difficult to carry in life: acceptance that all things pass, even the need to understand them completely. The oil lamp between them flickered slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of this thought. Outside the chamber, the fortress continued its disciplined breathing, unaware that within its walls two forms of solitude were meeting, one built upon structure and permanence, and the other upon wandering and release. Between them lay a quiet tension, not of conflict but of recognition, as if each saw in the other a reflection of what it might have become under different skies. When night deepened over Alamut, Yunis was not dismissed nor detained, but allowed to remain within its guest chambers. where the wind pressed softly against the stone like a memory-seeking entry. And it is here that part one of this tale rests, not in conclusion but in waiting, as all true encounters do before they reveal whether they will become memory or silence. The night over Alamut did not fall like a sudden curtain, but rather settled slowly, as if the mountains themselves were exhaling after a long thought. Within the guest chambers, where Dervish Yunis rested, there was no true sleep at first, only the quiet negotiation between memory and silence as the mind attempts to understand what the heart has already accepted. The fortress at night was different from its daytime certainty, its corridors softened by dim oil light, its stone walls no longer resembling authority, but something more fragile, like the bones of an old idea that still stands because it has not yet been forgotten. It is said that Yunis walked once again through a narrow passage before dawn, not because he was forbidden to remain still, but because wandering had become the natural language of his thoughts. In that quiet hour he heard the distant sound of water being drawn from a well, and the faint turning of pages in a room where a scribe recorded words that would outlive their speakers. At the heart of this place lived Hasan-i Sabbah, whose name outside these walls carried weight like iron, but within them was spoken more carefully, as if even speech had learned discipline. Yet what the narrator of this tale finds most curious is not his authority, but the stillness that surrounded him, a stillness not of emptiness but of intense focus, like a blade resting without motion, yet never forgetting its purpose. In the early hours Yunis was once more summoned, not with urgency but with the patience of those who understand that meaningful encounters cannot be hurried. When he entered the inner chamber, he found Hasan-i Sabbah seated in the same manner as before, as if the night had not passed but merely deepened. The oil lamp had been replaced, and the air carried the faint scent of parchment and ink, and something more subtle which might have been exhaustion or reflection, or both intertwined like old threads in a single garment. Hasan-i Sabbah did not rise, nor did he gesture, for formalities had no meaning between men who had already stepped beyond the need for them. Instead, he asked Yunis a question that travelers rarely hear and rulers seldom dare to speak aloud. He asked what remains of a man when his desires are stripped away, not through force, but through time and understanding. Yunis remained silent for a long moment, and in that silence there was no hesitation, only the careful listening to a question that was not aimed at the mind alone, but at the deeper places where experience settles like dust in the corners of memory. Then he answered that what remains is not greatness nor emptiness, but attention, the ability to witness one's own passing thoughts without becoming their prisoner, and to recognize that even longing has its season and its retreat, like rivers that change course without losing their nature. The response did not please or displease the master of Alamut, for such reactions belong to those who still measure truth by comfort and discomfort, and Hasan-i Sabbah was a man who had long moved beyond such measures. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, as if examining not the words, but the silence behind them, and it is said that in that moment the space between them felt less like a meeting, and more like a mirror placed between two different kinds of solitude. One had chosen walls and order and discipline as its form, while the other had chosen roads, dust, and uncertainty. Yet both had arrived at a place where certainty itself had become less important than awareness. Beyond the chamber, the fortress began to awaken as dawn approached, and footsteps grew more frequent, carrying with them the rhythm of duty and continuation. But inside there was a stillness that did not belong to time. The narrator of this tale must emphasize that no grand debate took place, no philosophical victory was declared, for such things belong to stories that wish to entertain rather than to remember. Instead, there were moments of speech separated by long intervals of silence, in which even the flicker of the lamp seemed to listen. What passed between them was not knowledge exchanged like coins, but recognition shared like breath between cold air and warm skin. At one point, Hasan-i Sabbah spoke of the burden of certainty, how a man who is believed without question must eventually learn to question himself in secret, lest he become a statue rather than a living being. Yunis, in turn, spoke of wandering not as escape, but as a form of humility where no place is allowed to become absolute, and therefore every place remains alive in the heart of the traveler. The conversation did not resolve anything, for resolution was never its purpose. Instead, it unfolded like a long corridor with no visible end. Yet each step revealed a different angle of the same truth, that human beings are always in transit, even when they believe themselves to be still. When morning light finally touched the upper stones of Alamut, turning them from gray to a pale gold that resembled both promise and memory, Yunis was once again free to leave or remain, though such words no longer held sharp meaning within him. It is said that before he departed he stood for a moment at the threshold and looked back, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement, as one acknowledges a place that has briefly reflected something within oneself that is usually hidden. There was no sadness in his gaze, only the quiet recognition that all encounters are temporary, even those that feel as though they might have always existed. And so Dervish Yunis descended from the fortress, along the same winding path where mist still lingered like unfinished thoughts, while behind him Alamut returned to its disciplined rhythm, holding within its stone the echo of a conversation that would not be recorded in official chronicles, yet would remain in the memory of those who were present as something difficult to name, but impossible to fully forget. Thus this part of the tale rests not in conclusion, but in continuation, as all journeys do when they pass through the lives of others, without ever truly stopping there. It is said that when Dervish Yunis descended from Alamut, the mountain did not seem to release him all at once, but rather held him in its awareness for a long time, as if uncertain whether a man who has passed through its silence should ever fully return to the ordinary rhythm of the world below. The path beneath his feet was the same path he had taken before, yet nothing about it felt identical, for even familiar stones appear altered when the mind carries a deeper stillness within it. The wind moved through the narrow passes with the same patience as always, and the distant valleys lay under a pale morning haze that softened their edges until they resembled memories rather than places. Yunis walked without urgency, not because he had nowhere to go, but because something in him had begun to understand that arrival is never a fixed point but a passing agreement between time and awareness. It is said that travelers who crossed his path on that descent noticed a quiet change in him, not in appearance, but in the way he carried silence, as though it had become less a companion and more a part of his own breathing. Meanwhile, in the fortress above, Hasan-i Sabbah remained within the structured stillness of his domain. Yet those who served him later spoke of a rare moment after the dervish had left, when he stood alone near a narrow window overlooking the cliffs and for a brief time did not give instruction or receive reports, but simply watched the movement of mist along the rocks as if observing something that could not be commanded or recorded. It is not known what passed through his thoughts, for men who live surrounded by certainty often learn to keep their inner questions hidden even from themselves. But the old scribes of the fortress noted that on that day his words were fewer and his pauses longer, as if some invisible thread had been loosened rather than cut. The narrator of this tale does not claim that either man changed the other in any dramatic sense, for such ideas belong to stories that prefer clarity over truth. Yet it can be said that something in the atmosphere of both their silences had been altered, as if two different rivers had briefly touched underground without merging, yet carrying afterward a trace of each other's taste. Yunis continued his journey southward through villages where tea was served in small cracked cups, and through caravanserai, where merchants spoke of distant markets with the tired enthusiasm of repetition. In each place he listened more than he spoke, as was his way, but now his listening seemed deeper, less like receiving and more like allowing the world to pass through him without resistance. There were evenings when he would sit near roadside fires, with strangers whose names he would never know, and hear fragments of lives, lost and found in equal measure. A man mourning a love that ended not in betrayal but in time. A musician who had forgotten the joy he once felt in his own melodies. A young traveler who believed the world still held answers if only he walked far enough. Yunis would not correct them nor guide them, for he had long abandoned the idea that human longing requires resolution. Instead, he would simply sit and let their words dissolve into the night air where they belonged, like smoke returning to sky. It is said that one night in a small settlement near the edge of the desert, he paused beneath a fig tree and listened to the sound of water moving through an unseen channel beneath the earth. In that moment he remembered nothing specific, yet felt everything at once, the weight of roads taken and not taken, the faces that had briefly illuminated his path, and the quiet realization that every encounter leaves behind a version of us that never fully returns to solitude. But this feeling did not bring sorrow, only a kind of gentle acceptance, like the closing of a book that was never meant to end in certainty. As seasons turned, the name of Yunis continued to move through oral memory, not as legend in the grand sense, but as a soft presence in conversations between elders who spoke of travelers, who changed the air of a room without speaking much, and who left behind no possessions, except a certain calm in those who had listened to them. And in distant Alamut the memory of his brief stay remained not as doctrine nor warning, but as an unrecorded pause in the fortress's long and disciplined chronicle, something that existed only in the minds of those who had been present. Slowly, even they began to speak of it less, not because it had faded, but because it had settled too deeply to be easily expressed. The narrator of this tale must finally say that Dervish Yunis was never seen arriving anywhere in a final sense, for his life was not shaped by destinations but by passages. What remains of him in these words is not a story of achievement nor revelation, but of presence moving gently through a world that continues to change without asking permission. And if there is any meaning to be gathered from his meeting within the walls of Alamut, it is perhaps this, that even the most disciplined certainty and the most wandering uncertainty share a hidden kinship in their longing to understand what it means to be here, for only a brief moment before becoming memory. And so the road continues as it always has beneath changing skies, carrying footsteps that will one day also become stories, told softly beside candlelight while the sound of distant music fades into the night.